Did you know that in just one peaceful morning, the entire world turned to a new chapter of history? Did you know that an event seemingly distant in Hawaii could change the fate not only of the United States, but of the entire world? December 7th, 1941, a day that President Franklin D. Roosevelt called a date which will live in infamy, marked a fateful turning point for humanity. It was the day Japan suddenly attacked Pearl Harbor, and in just a few short hours, America was forced to abandon its policy of staying out of the war, becoming the central player in the bloodiest conflict in history. Before that day, most Americans still believed that World War II was a matter for Europe and Asia. They thought that the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were wide enough to shield the United States from the flames of war. But the bombs that thundered over Pearl Harbor shattered that illusion. When the massive ships of the Pacific Fleet went up in flames, when thousands of soldiers perished in a storm of bombs and bullets, Americans realized that war had knocked on their own door, and there was no turning back. What made Japan dare to strike directly at America's most important military base in the Pacific? Was it simply a bold attack, or were there far more complex calculations behind it? There were secrets that only decades later began to surface. Japanese spies who had infiltrated the Hawaiian community to gather intelligence. Intelligence reports that warned of a possible attack but were ignored. And mistakes in decision-making that led to an unavoidable disaster. Imagine being an American soldier on that morning. A calm Sunday, the sea shimmering under the sun, the bugles sounding as usual. You're preparing breakfast, writing a letter home, or simply resting after days of training. No one thought that only minutes later, the sky above would blaze with hundreds of planes marked with the red sun, and life as they knew it would be turned upside down. But before the first gunfire rang out, before the first bomb fell on the deck of the USS Arizona, there had already been warning signs. Historians have found plenty of evidence showing that Washington was not entirely blind. Many intelligence reports had warned that Japan was preparing for a major operation. Commanders even knew that an attack could happen anywhere from Southeast Asia and the Philippines to Hawaii. But overconfidence, the belief that Japan would not dare to strike such a distant base, cost them dearly in blood. One little-known story tells that months before the tragedy, Japanese agents quietly arrived in Hawaii, posing as students, merchants, or even ordinary workers. They blended in with locals, observing daily activities inside the U.S. naval base, noting the positions of warships, the number of soldiers, and guard routines. Those reports were later sent back to Tokyo and became the key to the attack plan. Meanwhile, in Washington, some of Japan's secret messages had been decrypted, but no one connected them quickly enough to the imminent danger. When the first engine sounds echoed from afar, many American soldiers thought it was just another routine drill. No one imagined that within minutes, the sky would erupt in flames, bombs exploding with deafening force. The massive ships, the pride of the U.S. fleet, burst into flames and sank beneath the sea as thousands of sailors struggled helplessly. Survivors swam through burning waters to rescue comrades, while on shore, soldiers frantically searched for weapons to fight back. Some even manned anti-aircraft guns they had never trained on, firing back in vain. Another secret few mention: the battle that day was not as perfect as Japan had planned. They sank many warships and killed thousands, but they missed crucial strategic targets. The oil depots, repair facilities, and shipyards at Pearl Harbor remained intact. That allowed America to quickly rebuild its fleet and return to the Pacific battlefield with terrifying strength only a short time later. Had Japan struck those facilities, history might have turned out very differently. After the tragedy, America was stunned, but also more united than ever before. Just one day later, Congress voted almost unanimously to declare war on Japan. And then, like dominoes, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, forcing America into a global conflict. The people, once determined to stay out, now became a massive home front, ready to produce, contribute, and sacrifice. From there, America's journey through World War II began, a journey filled with hardship, but also glory, where the United States not only avenged Pearl Harbor, but reshaped the entire course of human history. In the following chapters, we will explore the deeper causes behind the attack, every brutal detail of that morning, and the path that led the U.S. to become the world's greatest superpower. But before diving into the causes, stop for a moment and ask yourself, why were such clear warning signs ignored? How could a powerful nation like the United States be caught off guard on its own soil? Could it be that within confidence sometimes lies blindness? And are we today truly safe? Or are we also living under similar illusions, waiting for a shock to wake us up? Turn back to the years before December 7, 1941, to understand why a distant Asian nation like Japan decided to launch a direct attack on the United States, a country with which, in theory, it had no direct battlefront before that. This story begins with the thirst for territory, resources, and power of the Japanese Empire in the first half of the 20th century. Since the late 19th century, Japan has undergone a dramatic transformation known as the Meiji Restoration. From a closed feudal island nation, Japan rose to become an industrial and military power strong enough to defeat China in the Sino-Japanese War of 1895, and even shock the world by defeating Imperial Russia in the War of 1904-1905. These victories fostered the belief that Japan was destined to dominate Asia, that its people had a sacred mission to lead the region. But along with that ambition came a harsh reality. Japan was a nation poor in natural resources. It lacked oil, iron, and rubber, the essential materials for war and modern industry. Meanwhile, European powers and the United States controlled most of those resources in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. As the world entered the 1930s, the global economic crisis and the rise of extreme nationalism pushed Japan further away from the path of cooperation. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. In 1937, it launched a full-scale war with China, beginning with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, followed by horrific atrocities such as the Nanjing Massacre, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed. The war in China drained enormous resources, forcing Japan to seek new supplies elsewhere. And this brought it into direct confrontation with the United States. The U.S., which had extensive trade relations with China, was outraged by Japan's aggression. From the late 1930s, Washington gradually imposed sanctions, starting with restrictions on steel and aviation fuel exports. But the decisive blow came in 1941, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an executive order completely banning oil exports to Japan. To grasp the severity of this decision, one must remember that Japan depended on the U.S. for more than 80% of its oil supply. Without oil, planes couldn't take off, warships couldn't sail, and tanks couldn't move. To Tokyo, this was nothing short of a death sentence for its imperial dream. In tense meetings held in Tokyo, Japan's leaders fiercely debated their options. One faction argued for negotiating with the U.S. to lift the embargo, but the other, led by military generals, believed there was only one way to survive: strike first, seize resources by force, especially in Southeast Asia, where there was oil in the Dutch East Indies, rubber in Malaya, and tin along with other minerals. However, to conquer those territories, Japan needed to ensure that the U.S. Pacific Fleet, stationed in Hawaii, could not intervene. Thus, the idea of a lightning attack on Pearl Harbor was born. A little-known detail is that before the first shot was fired, Japan carried out one of the boldest intelligence operations of the era. For months, Japanese agents had been stationed in Hawaii under the guise of merchants, students, and even restaurant workers. They secretly mapped the docking positions of every battleship, airfield, and ammunition depot. One of the most important spies was Takeo Yoshikawa, who operated under the cover of a consulate employee in Honolulu. His detailed reports helped the Japanese Navy Command design a shockingly precise attack plan. Meanwhile, in Washington, vague warnings began to surface. American intelligence had decrypted some of Japan's telegrams, revealing that Tokyo was preparing for a major action. But most U.S. generals believed that if Japan were to strike, it would target British or Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia, not dare to attack Hawaii over 6,000 kilometers away. This mindset led to American complacency and left them vulnerable to a stunning blow. Interestingly, in November 1941, while the Japanese fleet was secretly training off the Kuril Islands, some Japanese diplomats were still in Washington negotiating with the Roosevelt administration. They tried to demand that the U.S. stop aiding China and resume oil exports, but Roosevelt firmly refused. In the final days before the attack, both sides were still exchanging diplomatic notes. But in reality, Tokyo had already approved the plan to strike Pearl Harbor weeks earlier. Another remarkable anecdote is that even within Japan, there were voices of dissent. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack plan, once said that if forced into war with the United States, he could only run wild for 6 months, after which he could not guarantee victory. He understood America's vast industrial power and believed that in the long run, Japan could not prevail. However, under pressure from militant generals, Yamamoto proceeded with the plan, though with great unease. Another often overlooked factor was the social mindset in Japan at the time. The people were indoctrinated to believe that their nation was being encircled by the West, that the U.S. and Britain were strangling Japan's economy, and that to survive, they had to expand overseas. The deep sense of humiliation and loss of status fueled intense nationalism, driving support for the idea of striking first to seize the upper hand. Thus, the causes leading to the Pearl Harbor attack were far more than a single military decision. It was the result of accumulated tensions: Japan's imperial ambition, its desperate need for resources, America's tough embargo policy, the arrogance of Japan's military leadership, Washington's overconfidence, and the deep East-West divide. All these forces converged into a historic storm that erupted on that calm Sunday morning. Before we move on to the next part, imagine this. If the U.S. had not imposed the oil embargo, would Japan have risked an attack? If Washington had trusted its intelligence reports, could it have prepared in time? If Yamamoto had been allowed to choose freely, could he have avoided this confrontation? History has no ifs, but these questions remind us that the tragedy of Pearl Harbor was a chain of misjudgments and irreconcilable conflicts, leading to one daring decision the world will never forget.
On the morning of Sunday, December 7, 1941, the sky over Hawaii was clear. The sea breeze gently brushed through the rows of palm trees, and life on the island of Oahu seemed as peaceful as any other day. It was a day off. Many sailors of the Pacific Fleet were still sleeping in after a night of fun, and many officers had left the base to attend church services or visit their families. No one could have imagined that in just a few minutes this place would turn into a fiery hell. Meanwhile, in the northern Pacific, a massive Japanese fleet was approaching Hawaii. The night before, 6 powerful Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, had quietly anchored in the vast ocean. On their decks, more than 350 fighter planes, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers were ready. The fleet was commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had been assigned to carry out Yamamoto's plan, to launch a lightning strike that would cripple the Pacific Fleet in an instant. At 6 a.m., the first planes took off. The roar of their engines tore through the calm air, but in Hawaii, people were still asleep or leisurely preparing for a day of rest. The squadrons split into groups, flying low over the sea to avoid radar detection. In fact, the U.S. military had installed a few radar stations, but most soldiers were not yet familiar with using them. Around 7 a.m., a radar station on the island of Oahu detected signals of a massive formation of aircraft approaching. 2 young soldiers immediately reported it to their superior. But the officer on duty that morning assumed it was just American planes flying in from the mainland for a scheduled exercise. The alert was ignored, and Hawaii fell into a state of complete unpreparedness. At exactly 7:55 a.m., the sky over Pearl Harbor suddenly shook with the roar of engines and the sound of bombs falling. The first bombs ripped through the air, exploding on runways and fuel depots. Japanese planes dived from above like steel arrows, releasing bursts of machine gun fire and torpedoes. Within seconds, the morning's peace vanished, replaced with flames, blood, and horrifying screams. Japan's main targets were the U.S. battleships anchored in the harbor. The USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, and many others lay lined up like giant beasts in deep sleep. When the first torpedoes struck, the ships shuddered violently as seawater rushed into their hulls. A bomb pierced directly into the ammunition magazine of the USS Arizona, triggering a massive explosion that turned the entire ship into a sea of fire within minutes. 1,177 sailors were trapped inside. Almost none survived. To this day, beneath the waters of Pearl Harbor, the Arizona remains like a vast graveyard where oil still leaks to the surface, known by the sorrowful name the Tears of Arizona. Not only the battleships, but also the airfields around the island became targets. American planes were destroyed on the ground before they could take off. Young pilots rushed to the runways, watching their aircraft burst into flames. A few daring ones managed to take off in the remaining planes and engage the overwhelming enemy in the sky. Among them were Lieutenant George Welsh and Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, who took off under desperate conditions and managed to shoot down several Japanese planes. They became heroes of that fateful day, symbols of unyielding resistance. There were also small but memorable stories. Some young sailors, upon hearing the alarm, thought it was only a drill, until they saw bombs exploding around them and realized the terrible truth. Some soldiers ran to their anti-aircraft positions, still holding coffee cups they hadn't finished. In the midst of the chaos, many fired back with whatever they had: rifles, machine guns, even handguns at the planes diving from the sky. A private named Joe Lockard, the man who had reported the radar signal that was ignored, sat in silence at the base, bitterly realizing that he had witnessed a moment that could have saved thousands of lives. In less than 2 hours, more than 2,400 Americans were killed, and over 1,000 others were injured. 8 battleships were sunk or heavily damaged, hundreds of aircraft were destroyed, and many military facilities were devastated. The Pacific Fleet seemed completely paralyzed. For the American people, it was an unprecedented shock, a national tragedy that left the entire country in grief and disbelief. Yet in Japan's seemingly perfect victory lay deadly mistakes. One little-known fact is that the Japanese did not attack the oil storage tanks and repair facilities at Pearl Harbor, vital lifelines for the U.S. Navy. Had they been destroyed, rebuilding the fleet could have taken years. But due to focusing too much on ships and planes, or fearing that prolonging the attack would cost them the element of surprise, Nagumo decided to withdraw after the second wave, missing the chance to completely wipe out American power. Historians later considered this one of Japan's greatest strategic blunders. Another secret revealed later was that not all of the U.S. fleet had been caught in the attack. The American aircraft carriers, the core force of modern naval warfare, happened to be away from the harbor that day, carrying out missions to deliver aircraft to distant islands. This coincidental absence spared the U.S. its most crucial tool for counterattack in the coming years. Had those carriers been sunk alongside the battleships, the history of the Pacific might have taken a very different course. In the final moments of the raid, the skies over Hawaii were filled with black smoke, the sea stained with blood, and America officially awoke from its dream of isolation. President Roosevelt was informed immediately. Upon hearing the casualty and damage reports, he remained silent for a few seconds, then spoke a line that would go down in history. "Today will live in infamy." But amid the flames and sorrow, the American spirit did not collapse. On the contrary, the attack on Pearl Harbor became the fire that forged the nation's determination. From the White House to the remote countryside, from factory workers to college students, everyone united with one resolve: America must rise, must retaliate, and must win. The attack on Pearl Harbor ended, but its echoes opened a new chapter in world history. From a surprise assault, the United States was thrust into a global war, and within just a few years, it would emerge as the decisive power on both fronts, Europe and the Pacific.
1941 ended with fire and thick black smoke rising from Pearl Harbor. The American people were shaken, and before the pain of loss could even fade, the next morning, December 8th, the entire nation turned its attention to Washington, D.C. At Congress, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped up to the podium. He was not a man who easily showed emotion, but that day his voice trembled with restrained intensity. His opening words would later go down in history. December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Only 7 words, yet every American understood that the era of neutrality was over. Republican and Democratic lawmakers, who often clashed bitterly, now rose together in unanimous applause as Roosevelt declared that the United States would enter the war against Japan. Only one vote opposed the decision, that of Congresswoman Jeannette Rankin, the first woman in the U.S. Congress, a lifelong pacifist. But amid the overwhelming sea of approval, her lone dissenting vote was nothing more than an echo lost in the storm. When Roosevelt signed the declaration of war against Japan, public sentiment in America erupted. The nation's major newspapers printed bold red headlines, "War." But what surprised many was the chain reaction that followed. On December 11th, just 4 days later, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler and Fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini both declared war on the United States. Roosevelt knew that from that moment, America would not only face an enemy in the Pacific, but would also step directly into a global conflict, becoming the central player in one of the greatest struggles in human history. In the first hours after declaring war, the United States faced a daunting question: how to mobilize its vast resources to prepare for a multi-front war. At that time, the U.S. military was not yet the powerful force it would become. In 1941, the American armed forces numbered only about 1.8 million men, while Germany already had millions of battle-hardened soldiers in Europe. The Pacific Fleet had been heavily damaged at Pearl Harbor, and many international observers believed America could not recover quickly. Yet that very shock became the spark that awakened the nation. From small towns to giant industrial cities, Americans united in a massive mobilization effort unlike anything before. One of Roosevelt's most remarkable achievements was transforming the civilian economy into a war machine. He called on corporations that made automobiles, refrigerators, and washing machines to halt consumer production and shift to manufacturing weapons. The Ford Motor Company, famous for its Model T assembly line, began producing B-24 bombers at an astonishing pace. Ford's Willow Run plant could roll out one B-24 every hour.
General Motors mass-produced tanks, military trucks, and aircraft engines. American industry became the arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt called it. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, more than 100,000 tanks, millions of rifles and machine guns, and billions of rounds of ammunition, numbers that dwarfed every other nation on Earth. What's fascinating is that this transformation didn't just occur in factories. It reshaped American society itself. For the first time, women entered the industrial workforce on a massive scale. The image of Rosie the Riveter, the factory girl with a red polka dot bandana and a flexed arm, became a symbol of wartime strength. Millions of women worked in munitions plants, shipyards, and aircraft factories, replacing the men who had gone to the front lines. The war also opened new opportunities for African Americans and other minority communities. Though discrimination persisted, hundreds of thousands of Black Americans joined the military or defense industries, laying the groundwork for the civil rights movement that would rise after the war. Parallel to military mobilization, the war brought challenges in intelligence and science. Few people know that as early as 1942, the United States established the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, the forerunner of the CIA. This intelligence agency sent operatives to Europe and Asia to gather information and sabotage Axis supply lines. These agents were often professors, journalists, or businessmen, yet they played a crucial role in Allied success. One famous anecdote tells of OSS agents in France using packets of powder that looked like bird droppings to scatter over German planes, forcing the enemy to waste hours cleaning them before takeoff, delaying bombing operations significantly. Equally important was the psychological strength Roosevelt skillfully inspired. Through his weekly radio broadcasts known as Fireside Chats, he spoke directly to millions of American families. His calm, reassuring voice comforted fears while igniting a sense of purpose, that America was fighting for the noble ideals of freedom and democracy around the world. That spiritual strength helped Americans endure rationing, buy war bonds, and send their sons to the front lines with pride and resolve. Of course, the road to war was not easy. In the early months of 1942, the situation was dire. In the Pacific, Japan seized one territory after another, from the Philippines and Singapore to key islands in the South Pacific. Tens of thousands of American troops were captured during the retreat from Bataan, many forced into the brutal Bataan Death March, where thousands died from starvation and torture. Such news filled America with outrage, further strengthening the resolve to fight to the end. Meanwhile, in Europe, Nazi Germany continued his rampage. Hitler controlled most of the continent and had launched his invasion of the Soviet Union. Americans understood they had to fight on two fronts, Japan in the Pacific and Germany and Italy in Europe. It was an unprecedented challenge, but also the beginning of America's rise as a global superpower. A little-known detail is that immediately after the declaration of war, the U.S. and Britain met in Washington to develop the Germany First strategy, focusing on defeating Nazi Germany before turning full strength to the Pacific. This decision was not easy. The pain of Pearl Harbor made many Americans eager for instant revenge against Japan. But Roosevelt and Churchill understood that Hitler posed the greatest threat to the world. This strategic choice allowed the U.S. to coordinate closely with Britain and the Soviet Union, forming a powerful alliance. In the short span between late 1941 and mid-1942, the United States transformed completely. A nation once determined to stay distant from global affairs became the center of a worldwide conflict. Factories ran a clock time, young men enlisted en masse, women joined production lines, scientists developed new weapons, and secret agents operated across continents. It was a breathtaking transformation few could have imagined before Pearl Harbor. From those first steps after the declaration of war, America laid the foundation for a dramatic shift in the world's balance of power. Industrial might, vast manpower, national unity, and an unbreakable will turned the United States from the victim of a surprise attack into the decisive force that would determine the outcome of World War II. And from that moment, the true story of America in war had only just begun.
During the war, the United States not only faced Japan in the Pacific, but also had to join a brutal conflict in Europe. This decision was not an easy one. Many Americans at the time still held isolationist views, unwilling to see their sons shed blood on distant lands across the Atlantic. But when Nazi Germany declared war on the U.S. in December 1941, all choices were gone. Washington was forced to commit its military and massive industrial power to the European conflict, where Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler was controlling nearly the entire continent. At that moment, the situation in Europe was dire. The Soviet Union was desperately resisting a massive invasion by German forces, while Britain struggled to endure after years of fighting alone. If the U.S. had not entered the war, the balance could have tipped entirely toward the Axis powers, and history might have taken a very different turn. Therefore, when America joined the war, it was not just a military decision. It was a move that reshaped the entire world order. At first, America's presence in Europe was demonstrated through the North African Campaign. This was where Hitler and Mussolini had expanded their influence, and the German army under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, had inflicted heavy defeats on the Allies. In November 1942, the U.S. launched its first major operation in North Africa, codenamed Torch. Tens of thousands of inexperienced American soldiers landed on the coasts of Morocco and Algeria. The first battles revealed that the U.S. military was unprepared for modern warfare. They suffered heavy losses against seasoned German units. But from battle to battle, American soldiers learned quickly, gaining strength and discipline. The North African Campaign became a baptism by fire for the U.S. Army, and it was there that commanders like Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton began to prove their brilliance. After defeating the Axis forces in Tunisia in May 1943, the U.S. and Britain expanded the campaign into mainland Europe, beginning with the invasion of Italy. In July 1943, Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, was launched. It was one of the largest amphibious operations of the time. The success in Sicily led to the collapse of the Italian government, Mussolini's overthrow, and Italy's surrender shortly thereafter. However, the campaign on the Italian peninsula dragged on longer than expected. The mountainous terrain and fierce German resistance turned it into a brutal battlefield. The Americans and Allies paid with tens of thousands of lives to advance slowly from southern to northern Italy. Still, these battles helped draw German forces away from the Eastern Front, where the Soviet Union was under immense pressure. Throughout 1943 and early 1944, while fighting in Italy remained fierce, American and British commanders were planning the largest operation in history, the invasion of northern France. The goal was to open a new front in Western Europe, liberate France, and push toward Germany. The operation was codenamed Overland, with its most crucial moment being D-Day, June 6, 1944. It became one of the most iconic events of World War II. Few people know that the Normandy invasion was prepared under absolute secrecy, supported by one of the most extensive deception operations ever carried out. The Allies built an entire fake army of inflatable tanks and aircraft in southeastern England, creating the illusion that the invasion would occur at Pas de Calais, where the English Channel was narrowest. Hitler and many of his generals fell for the deception and kept most of their elite troops in Calais, leaving the Normandy beaches less fortified. This deception was a decisive factor in the invasion's success. On the night before D-Day, thousands of American and British paratroopers dropped behind German lines to capture bridges, block reinforcements, and create chaos in enemy ranks. Early on June 6th, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers, along with thousands of ships and aircraft, simultaneously attacked the Normandy coast. Omaha Beach, where American troops landed, turned into hell on earth. German defenses there were much stronger than expected. Machine guns, artillery, and mines turned the beach into a slaughterhouse. Thousands of Americans fell within the first few hours. Some units lost more than half their men. But with unyielding courage, the U.S. soldiers broke through the defenses and opened the way for the full invasion. An interesting detail few know is that the exact timing of the invasion was almost changed. The weather over the English Channel was terrible in early June. High winds and rough seas made landings nearly impossible. But James Stagg, a Scottish meteorologist, predicted that June 6th would bring a brief window of clear skies. Eisenhower trusted his forecast and made the risky decision to proceed. He was right. Without that short weather break, D-Day might have been delayed for months, and the course of the war could have changed completely. After securing the Normandy beaches, American and British troops advanced deeper into France. The Battle for Normandy raged through the summer of 1944, with bloody clashes at Caen, Saint-Lô, and Falaise. Every village and every field was won with blood. But by August, the Allies liberated Paris amid the overwhelming joy of the French people. Soon after, American forces rapidly pushed eastward, nearing Germany's borders. Meanwhile, Hitler still hoped to turn the tide. In December 1944, he launched a desperate counterattack in the Ardennes region of Belgium, known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was the last major German offensive on the Western Front. In the early days, the Germans struck unexpectedly and pushed deep into U.S. lines, creating a bulge-shaped gap on the battle map, hence the name. Many American units were surrounded in harsh winter conditions, especially in the town of Bastogne. But they held firm, and with timely reinforcements, the U.S. forces repelled the Germans. It was Hitler's final major defeat, leaving him incapable of mounting another large-scale offensive. By early 1945, American and Allied forces crossed the Rhine River and entered Germany. At the same time, Soviet troops advanced from the east, tightening the noose. By May 1945, Berlin fell. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker, and Nazi Germany officially surrendered. The war in Europe ended, ushering in a new era in which the United States emerged as one of the most powerful nations on Earth. America's role in Europe was not just about military strength, but also about industrial might. Over 4 years of war, U.S. factories produced millions of guns, tens of thousands of tanks, planes, and warships. This industrial output became the lifeline of the Allied forces. British Prime Minister Churchill once said that it was America's industrial power that gave the Allies the tools to win. Moreover, the arrival of millions of American soldiers in Europe created the decisive force that broke through the Axis defenses. The war in Europe also left behind countless lesser-known stories. During the Normandy campaign, some American soldiers were just 18 years old, leaving home for the first time, only to watch their comrades fall beside them. Some French farmers quietly aided American troops, hiding them from German patrols. And there were tragic tales, too, when bombs inadvertently claimed civilian lives. Together, these stories painted a sorrowful yet radiant picture of sacrifice and courage. Looking back, it's clear that America's involvement in Europe not only helped defeat Hitler, but also shaped the post-war world order. The alliance between the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union, despite their differences, created an unstoppable force. After the war, the U.S. did not retreat into isolationism as it did after World War I. Instead, Washington took a central role in founding the United Nations, rebuilding Europe through the Marshall Plan, and defining the era of the Cold War.
Neared its end, the Pacific Front became the fiercest battlefield, where the United States and Japan faced each other in life-and-death struggles that stretched from tiny deserted islands to vast open seas. After the shock of Pearl Harbor, many believed it would take America years to recover. But within just a few months, the industrial strength and fighting spirit of the United States proved otherwise. From being caught off guard, America quickly shifted to counterattack, gradually seizing the initiative in the Pacific theater.
The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was the first and most crucial turning point. After capturing vast territories in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, Japan aimed to expand further, seeking to eliminate the U.S. Navy from the region entirely. They chose Midway, a small atoll between Hawaii and Japan, as their target. If they captured Midway, Japan would gain a strategic position to control the entire Pacific. But the Japanese had no idea their plan had been decoded. Thanks to the silent efforts of American cryptographers, including young intelligence officers and a special group of Native American Navajo Code Talkers, the U.S. Navy learned of the attack plan. The Navajo language was nearly impossible for any enemy to decipher, and these code talkers played an invaluable role in transmitting secure communications for the U.S. military. When the battle broke out, the Americans, though outnumbered, held the upper hand thanks to intelligence information. Over 4 days of fierce combat, the U.S. sank 4 of Japan's main aircraft carriers, including those that had taken part in the Pearl Harbor attack. This was an irreparable loss for Japan. After Midway, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted decisively toward the United States. American morale soared, while Japan's belief in its invincibility was shattered. However, the road to victory was far from easy. After Midway, the U.S. launched a strategy known as island hopping, which meant not attacking every island occupied by Japan, but instead capturing key strategic locations to move gradually closer to the Japanese mainland. The Battle of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, which lasted from August 1942 to February 1943, was a testament to this brutality. It was America's first major ground offensive against Japan. U.S. soldiers fought in jungles plagued by malaria with shortages of food and ammunition, while Japanese troops fought to the last breath. After months of grueling combat, the U.S. captured Guadalcanal, opening the door to the Western Pacific. From that point on, the war was no longer Japan's expansion, but America's steady counteroffensive. Throughout 1943 and 1944, bloody battles continued. The Americans landed on Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Each island was a fortress, filled with tunnels, machine guns, and artillery waiting. Japanese troops were often more willing to die than to surrender. At Tarawa, in just 3 days, more than 1,000 Americans were killed, and nearly the entire Japanese garrison was wiped out. The brutality of these battles made America realize that capturing each small island came at a terrible cost, but it was the only path toward Japan. One of the most famous battles was Iwo Jima, which began in February 1945. The small island, only 21 square kilometers in size, held immense strategic importance. It lay between Guam and Japan, and capturing it would allow the U.S. to use it as a base for bombers and escort planes. But the Japanese had turned Iwo Jima into an underground fortress. They dug hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, built reinforced shelters, and hid artillery and machine guns. When American troops landed, they faced an unprecedented storm of fire. The battle lasted more than a month, with over 6,800 Americans killed and nearly the entire Japanese troops fighting to the last man. The image of 5 U.S. Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi became an immortal symbol of World War II, etched forever in the memory of the world. Not long after Iwo Jima, the Battle of Okinawa erupted in April 1945. It was the largest and bloodiest battle in the Pacific. Okinawa was seen as the gateway to Japan. More than 180,000 U.S. troops, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers, and hundreds of thousands of civilians were drawn into the war's vortex. The Japanese employed kamikaze tactics. Pilots flew planes packed with explosives directly into American warships. These desperate attacks sank dozens of ships and killed thousands of sailors. But in the end, the U.S. emerged victorious after nearly 3 months, leaving behind a devastated battlefield. The Battle of Okinawa made U.S. leaders realize that invading the Japanese mainland would ex an unimaginable cost. In this context, President Harry Truman faced one of the most difficult decisions in history: to use the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project, the secret research program to develop this new weapon, had succeeded by the summer of 1945. Hoping to end the war swiftly and spare hundreds of thousands of American lives that would be lost in an invasion, Truman ordered atomic bombs to be dropped on Japan. On August 6, 1945, the first bomb fell on Hiroshima, destroying the city and killing over 70,000 people instantly. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing more than 40,000 more. Just days later, Japan announced its unconditional surrender, bringing World War II to an end. But the story of the Pacific is not just about brutal battles or atomic bombs. It is also about the sacrifice and resilience of those often forgotten. The Navajo Code Talkers played a crucial role, as their language became the key to secure communications. Countless unnamed soldiers fought on remote islands they had never even heard of before. And millions of workers back home labored day and night in factories, producing weapons, ammunition, ships, and aircraft, turning America into a massive war machine. When the war ended, the Pacific Front had claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of American soldiers and millions of Japanese, both military and civilian. Those battles left scars that would never heal in the memories of both nations. Yet, they also marked a historic turning point. From a nation caught off guard at Pearl Harbor, America had risen, not only to defeat Japan, but to establish itself as the world's leading superpower.
Shots faded on the Pacific Front, the world entered an entirely new era. In 1945, the war ended, but the legacy it left behind forever changed the role of the United States in human history. Before the war, America had tended to stand apart, letting Europe and Asia resolve their own problems. But after Pearl Harbor was attacked, the U.S. was forced to step in, and when it was all over, no nation doubted it anymore. The United States had become the world's #1 superpower. Victory in World War II not only strengthened America's military might, but also lifted its economy to unprecedented heights. While many nations in Europe and Asia were devastated, with cities in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, and millions of civilians left destitute, the U.S. suffered virtually no damage on its own soil. On the contrary, by supplying weapons, machinery, and essential goods to both its military and its allies, American industry boomed. People often called post-1945 America the workshop of the world, where everything, from tanks and airplanes to rations, was produced in massive quantities. That wealth and power quickly turned into political influence. From a nation once focused on defending its own borders, the U.S. became the center of international order-making. The United Nations, founded in 1945 with headquarters in New York, was the clearest proof of this new role. Many think the UN was simply the result of global consensus after the war, but in truth, it was the strong financial, military, and diplomatic backing of the United States that ensured its existence. The U.S. was not only a founding member, but the very soul of the organization, designed to maintain peace and prevent another world war. However, along with the glory of victory, another dangerous door was opened: nuclear weapons. When 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world was stunned to realize that humanity had entered an age where a single decision made in minutes could destroy the entire planet. The U.S. became the only country to possess this ultimate weapon in 1945, and that brought not only power, but also fear. The balance of power was no longer determined by the number of soldiers or warships, but by the ability to unleash nuclear destruction. This marked the beginning of the Cold War era, when America faced an equal rival, the Soviet Union, in a tense, silent arms race. Millions of American veterans returned home after the war, carrying memories of bloody battles. They became the foundation of a new society in the U.S. The government passed the GI Bill, allowing veterans to borrow money to buy homes, attend college, and start businesses. This was an unprecedented turning point in American history, as for the first time, millions of ordinary Americans had access to higher education and property ownership. From this emerged a vast middle class that fueled rapid economic growth during the 1950s and 1960s. From these families also came a population explosion known as the baby boom. The children born in the post-war years grew up in a prosperous society and became the generation that would later drive major cultural, artistic, and social revolutions. The war also brought about another silent revolution, the role of women in American society. During the war, as millions of men went off to fight, American women entered factories for the first time, wielding wrenches, hammers, welding steel, and assembling airplanes. The image of Rosie the Riveter with her raised arm and slogan, "We can do it," was not just propaganda, but a reflection of truth. Women proved they could do jobs once reserved for men. After the war, though many returned to traditional family roles, the mark they left became the seed of the feminist movement that would later erupt. A little-known detail is that during wartime, America developed many technologies that would later transform civilian life. Radar, jet aircraft, antibiotics like penicillin, and especially early research into electronic computers all stemmed from military needs. For example, to decode enemy ciphers, scientists developed the first computers capable of high-speed calculations. After the war, these advancements were not wasted, but quickly applied to everyday life, from medicine to aerospace. NASA, America's space agency, directly benefited from wartime scientific achievements. It could be said that without this war, humanity might have had to wait much longer to set foot on the moon in 1969. Change also came to the global political map. The U.S. and the Soviet Union divided spheres of influence across the world, with Europe at the center of confrontation. While Western Europe received aid from the Marshall Plan, initiated by the U.S. to rebuild its economy, Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control. The world was split in two, and the term Cold War became an enduring anxiety for nearly half a century. Few realized that the Marshall Plan was not just generosity, but also a shrewd strategy to stop the spread of communism in war-torn Europe. Thanks to this aid, Western European nations quickly recovered and became America's close allies in NATO. Not only internationally, but the war's impact also deeply imprinted itself on American culture. Movies, novels, and songs about World War II became part of the collective memory. Americans began to see themselves as the world's liberators, bringing freedom to Europe and Asia. The story of the greatest generation, those who fought in the war, was passed down as a source of national pride. Yet alongside that pride came painful questions. Was dropping the atomic bombs truly necessary? Could victory have been achieved without costing hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilian lives? These debates continue even today, reminding us that war always comes with moral dilemmas. Another often overlooked detail is that many of the world's later scientific and political figures were products of the post-war era. For example, through Operation Paperclip, hundreds of German scientists, including Wernher von Braun, the father of the V-2 rocket, were brought to America. They later played a crucial role in NASA's space program, helping the U.S. become the first nation to put humans on the moon. This stands as one of history's strange ironies. From the ruins of war, humanity's greatest scientific leaps were born. World War II ended, but its influence echoed throughout the 20th century and even into the 21st. The United States emerged not only as a military and economic superpower, but also as the symbol of a new world order. Yet with that status came heavy responsibilities, maintaining peace, confronting new threats, and sometimes making controversial decisions to intervene. From Korea to Vietnam, from Iraq to Afghanistan, later wars all bore traces of the America that had stepped into the light since Pearl Harbor.
Looking back, it is clear that victory in World War II not only lifted America, but also shaped the entire world we live in today. Modern cities, advanced technologies, international institutions, and even today's global political tensions all in some way trace their roots to the events of 1941 to 1945. It stands as proof of history's power. In just a few years, the global order can be completely transformed, and its legacy can endure for generations.
Of World War II fell silent. The world turned to an entirely new chapter of history. For the United States, the event of Pearl Harbor was not just a shock, a tragedy, or a battle that opened the war. It was the beginning of a profound transformation that took America from a nation once wishing to stay out of distant conflicts to the very center of global power. But more important than that, from that very moment, Americans and the rest of the world realized that no nation could remain on the sidelines when the flames of war erupted. A single surprise attack could change the fate of millions in just a few short hours. And that is the lasting legacy of Pearl Harbor. In the days after the war, Americans faced a new reality. Millions of soldiers returned from the front lines, carrying memories of blood and fire. They stepped back into everyday life, but the shadow of war never left them. A new generation was born, the one that had lived through war, endured loss, and rebuilt the nation together. They were called the greatest generation, for it was through hardship that they found the strength to make America the richest and most powerful country on earth. From 1945 onward, the United States was no longer an outsider in world affairs. Washington became the coordinating center, leading alliances, founding the United Nations, launching the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, and entering a new tense era known as the Cold War. If not for the blow at Pearl Harbor, would America have ever abandoned its centuries-old policy of isolationism? That question still sparks debate among historians today. Interestingly, right after the war, people began to revisit the days before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. Many secret documents were decoded, revealing that warnings had been missed and signs had been ignored. Some intelligence officers had even intercepted strange cables from Tokyo, but their reports never reached the right people in time. Because of that, many still believe that Pearl Harbor was not only a failure against an enemy, but also a failure to listen and prepare. This lesson became a guiding principle for future generations, that complacency can cost an entire tragedy. For decades, the image of Pearl Harbor has lived not only in textbooks and museums, but deeply within American popular culture. Movies, songs, and memorials all remind Americans that peace is sometimes just a fragile mist, easily torn apart by the unexpected. In Hawaii, the wreck of the USS Arizona still lies beneath the waves, leaking tiny drops of oil known as the tears of Arizona. Tourists from around the world come not only to see a piece of history, but to feel the fragility of human destiny amid the storms of history. Yet Pearl Harbor left behind more than sorrow and pain. It also ignited America's drive to change. Because of that shock, the nation mobilized its full economic and scientific potential. Automobile factories turned into assembly lines for tanks, aircraft, and weapons. From modest laboratories emerged massive projects like the Manhattan Project, opening the nuclear age. And from this transformation came the post-war boom. Military technology turned into civilian innovation, sending humans into space, creating modern electronics, medicine, and aviation. One could say that today's world, with intercontinental flights, cities glowing with light, and a globally connected internet, still carries the mark of that wartime momentum. But perhaps the greatest impact of Pearl Harbor was psychological. For Americans, it became clear that their country, though distant from much of the world, was not invulnerable. They no longer believed the oceans could be a permanent shield. That very mindset made the United States the global guardian, with military bases and alliances across 5 continents.
Some support this, believing it's the only way to prevent another catastrophe. Others oppose it, fearing that too broad a military presence could entangle the nation. But no one can deny that Pearl Harbor was the starting point of that global mission. From today's perspective, the lessons of Pearl Harbor remain profoundly relevant. Instead of bomber fleets, the modern world faces new threats: terrorism, cyber attacks, pandemics, and energy crises. They can strike unexpectedly, causing damage just as severe as in 1941. And just like in 1941, one mistake in judgment, one delay in action, could make the entire world pay the price. So when we look back on Pearl Harbor, it's not only to honor those who fell, but also to ask ourselves, are we truly prepared for another day of surprise? If a similar shock were to happen in the 21st century, would the world be able to unite, or would it collapse into chaos? Perhaps that is the true power of history. It is not merely a story of the past, but a mirror reflecting both the present and the future. Pearl Harbor teaches us never to be complacent, that peace must be guarded through vigilance, dialogue, and the courage to face danger. And now, as you've journeyed with me through this historic event, from its deep causes to its tragic moments and lasting legacy, I want to leave you with one question. If you had lived in Hawaii on that morning, how would you have reacted when the sirens began to wail? Would you have run for shelter or taken up arms to fight? Share your thoughts in the comments, because it's through reflection that history truly comes alive. So we don't just hear it, but learn from it. And if you want to continue exploring fascinating historical stories and fresh perspectives on America's past and the world's, don't forget to subscribe to U.S. History. Your subscription gives us the motivation to bring you more dramatic tales, little-known anecdotes, and meaningful lessons for today. History has never been only about yesterday. It always touches today and opens questions for tomorrow. And who knows, perhaps in the next video, you'll find the answer to something that still lingers in your mind.